Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us in beautiful Southern California. Can you believe the last time that we were all together in person was January of 2020, and a lot has changed since then. I know many of you spent the day at our Audit Committee Leadership Forum doing a deep dive into the Audit Committee's agenda, which is really so important no matter which committee you serve on. But it's also important to take some time and take a step back and think about the big picture. Risk is certainly a big part of that big picture. And with all of the uncertainty and disruption we're facing, it's something we're thinking about all the time. But the other side of that coin, of course, is tremendous opportunity and transformational change. We have an exciting lineup over the next day and a half to help us challenge assumptions, connect the dots, get a better view of where the world is headed. And to kick things off, we are privileged to have two icons of broadcast news with us who have seen seismic shifts in politics, journalism, and media innovation over 4 decades of reporting. So Katie Couric is an award-winning journalist, author of the memoir and #1 New York Times bestseller, Going There, and co-founder of Stand Up for Cancer. Following 15 years as co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, she was the first woman to solo anchor a network evening newscast, serving as anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News. Katie has won the DuPont Columbia, a Peabody, a Walter Cronkite Award, and multiple Emmys. In 2017, she founded Katie Couric Media, which has developed a number of media projects, including the daily newsletter, Wake Up Call, and the podcast, Next Question, a digital video series, and several documentaries. Judy Woodruff is a senior correspondent for PBS NewsHour, after serving 11 years as its anchor and managing editor. Judy covered politics and other news for over 4 decades at CNN, NBC, and PBS, winning prestigious awards in journalism, including the Peabody Journalistic Integrity Award and the Emmy for Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2013, Judy was named co-anchor of the PBS NewsHour, alongside Gwen Ifill, making the first time an American national news broadcast would be co-anchored by 2 women. Judy's currently undertaking a reporting project called America at a Crossroads to better understand the country's political divide. So please join me and welcome Katie Couric and Judy Woodruff.
Katie, you're a mogul.
Not yet, but I'm working on it. Hi, everyone. We're so excited to be here. First of all, we belong to the Mutual Admiration Society. Well, I hope Judy does, but I'm such a huge fan of Judy's, and to be able to have a conversation with her to talk about so many things, it's going to be hard to get us off the stage, because I think we could gab for a few hours, don't you?
We've started to backstage, and we are so happy to continue. We're both very happy to be here with all of you, and it's a treat for me to even get to spend time with you. We live in different cities.
And, but have known each other for many, many years. So I think I'll just start by letting you all get to know us a little bit in terms of why we got into the business. So Judy, I'm curious, tell us what attracted you to I have to wear my glasses because I can't see. What attracted you to journalism back in the day? And I know a little of this story, but not the complete one, so.
Well, I'll try not to go back to the Garfield administration. I've been covering politics for a long time, but not quite back that far. But the truth is, I have to say a little bit about my background. I was born and raised in a military family, raised as an Army brat, born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, lived there only 5 years, and ended up going to 7 different schools by the 7th grade. So we lived in Taiwan, we lived in Germany, Missouri, Oklahoma, again, Georgia, North Carolina, New Jersey, all over the world. And I think in a way that later on led to my interest in journalism. I had no idea at the time what I was going to do, of course. But when I was growing up, my mother had not even finished 10th grade. My father had not gone to college. So I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I had a lot of conversations in high school with teachers. And I was one of those people who joined every club. I was in the drama club. I was in the French club because I was trying to figure out what I was interested in. And finally, some teacher said, well, you did well on the math SAT, you ought to major in math, and you could be an insurance actuary.
That sounds fun.
And I said, okay, I'll try it. But I ended up in college taking calculus. Professors at this point, this is 1964, 65, didn't think women should be taking calculus. I got kind of a negative signal there. Fell in love, though, with political science. I had another professor. You'll hear the story. The teachers in my life have made a huge difference. She encouraged me to change my major. I did. I transferred to Duke, graduated from there, studied political science, had no idea about journalism, Katie, until I was just about to look for a job in Washington, when the women I worked with in a summer internship in Washington said, you're going to be the gopher. You're going to be the coffee girl. And I went back to college my senior year, and I thought, I don't want to do that. I'd rather do anything practically. And I had a professor who said, well, did you ever think about covering politics? That's literally how it happened. It was like a light bulb went off. I thought, covering politics, that sounds like a lot of fun. I could interview politicians, find out what they're doing. And that's what happened. I applied for a job, was hired as the newsroom secretary at the ABC station in Atlanta. This was in the summer of 1968 when I graduated from college. And you asked me, why did I gravitate that way? I think another reason is, frankly, when I was growing up, I, of course, lived through the assassination of President Kennedy, and I remembered his administration, and what he said to all of us of our generation was, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, and that stayed with me. So not that I had some high-minded idea of it all, but I wanted in some way to be part of understanding what makes this country tick, and that's what happened. What about you?
Well, I think I had a similar, sort of similar. My dad was a print journalist. He worked for United Press, and he worked for the Atlanta Constitution.
Yes.
With Celestine Sibley, and probably way before you, Judy. But
no. I read Celestine Sibley.
Yeah, she was there for a very long time. But I think my dad recognized that I was not very good at math, and I think I was sort of the prototypical girl who wasn't encouraged to really pursue math and science when I was younger. But I was a good writer. I was I worked well under deadline. My dad used to say I did my homework in front of the front door before the bus came every morning. And I think also I'm extremely outgoing and curious. And so I think my father really directed me into journalism. I went to the University of Virginia. I majored in American Studies. I tried to get a good, broad liberal arts background instead of going to journalism school per se, like at the University of Missouri or Northwestern. And I started, as a desk assistant at ABC News in Washington, getting coffee for Sam Donaldson and, handing out rundowns. So I started on the ground floor, but then when CNN started, I had an opportunity to do a lot more than just make coffee, because as a fledgling news network, they were letting me cover stories. It was ridiculous because I looked like this and I sounded like that. And one time they let me cover the White House, I think when President Reagan, and I had to give his schedule, and the head of CNN called the news desk in Washington and said, I never want to see her on the air again. So
Nice.
Yeah, it was not a very auspicious beginning. But both Judy and I think, went into broadcast journalism in an era when it was not necessarily super hospitable to women. And in fact, you have a funny story about that, Judy, as I recall, and I have several myself.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I mentioned going to work as the newsroom secretary for the ABC station. So here I am, I'm a senior in college, and I show up in the lobby of this station, and the news director's sitting there, Mr. Conover, I called him, and we had a conversation, and at the end of the conversation, he said, okay, you'll be the newsroom secretary, you'll be answering the phone, cleaning the film, because that's what we use, and we can talk about that later, cleaned the film, and by the way, he didn't mention it, but I ended up getting the coffee, which was what I thought I was avoiding, but that's what I was doing. As I got up to leave, he said, and I said, "Thank you, Mr. Conover, I'm so appreciative of this opportunity." And he said, "Of course, how could I not hire somebody with legs like yours?" So I would love to tell you that I had some brilliant quip come back. I didn't. I just sort of slumped. I think I went from whatever height I am down to about 2 feet and just sort of slid out the door. But that was the world that we lived in then.
I can beat you on body parts.
Okay, all right.
So I'll take legs and raise you a breast. So I always joke that I got into the business when harass was 2 words instead of 1. It always takes a second for that to sink in. But, it's funny because when I was at CNN, right when they went on the air, as I told you, went from ABC to CNN, I walked into a meeting. I was 26 years old, and the vice president of the network, Ed Turner, who you knew.
I did.
I don't know what he was talking about, but it was a table just full of men. I felt like it was a scene out of Mad Men. And who was the redhead who they always looked at her chest? Do you remember? What was her name? Anybody?
I can't think of her name.
Okay. Really? Mad Men? Nobody? Joan. No. Yeah, Joan.
It was Joan.
Yeah, it was Joan, not Peggy. It was Joan. But anyway, I walked in and they were all talking, and suddenly he looked up and he goes, "Well, that's not why Katie's successful. She's successful because of her, work ethic, her excellent writing skills, and her breast size." In front of like 8 guys. And I was like, "What?" So I went back, and do you remember?
Did something.
Yeah, Don Farmer.
Yes.
Well, I was so shaken by the whole thing, and I was mortified. I just sat down, and I didn't have a snappy retort, but I went back and told the anchor I worked for, named Don Farmer. It was a husband and wife anchor team, Don and Chris, and I'm sure you know Don and Chris. Don's passed away. But I told him what happened, and he said, "Sit down. We're going to write him a memo right now." So together, Don and I crafted this memo that said, what you did today in that meeting was completely unacceptable. It was sexist, it was inappropriate, and I would like you to apologize to me immediately. I'll keep this matter between us. In other words, I'm not going to go to HR. I don't even think I knew what HR was at the time. So I sent it off, and he called me and he was like, "I am so sorry." But can you imagine?
No. Although,
Of course you can imagine.
of course I can. No, it was a different era. We're talking 60s. I'm about a decade older than Katie, so I had hoped that by the time my generation went through this, that her generation, and certainly the generations after us, and we can talk about this in a minute, wouldn't be dealing with the kind of thing that we're discussing here. It's taken longer than we wanted to. We had hoped that some of the high-profile things that have happened would have changed the entire ethos. It hasn't. But we are doing better. We are doing a lot better. Whatever remarks are made today are much more subtle than they used to be. It doesn't make it okay. And I think the best thing, though, is that women today, I think, have the courage to speak up, as you did. You did at a very early age. You had the chutzpah.
I think with Don's encouragement, though, without him, I don't know if I would have.
Yeah, I didn't have that kind. I just couldn't bring myself to say anything. When I heard that, I just crumpled. I thought, this is this the way it's going to be?
But back in the day, you could have repercussions for speaking out, and I still think that exists today, although I do think the Me Too movement has, I think the fact, and some people can argue the pendulum swung too far, but I think it's really put people on notice about
I think so too.
Certain behaviors, and that they're much more careful about that.
I do think we've come a long way. I think change has happened, and we should celebrate that. I think we need to talk about it when bad things happen, but we also need to acknowledge that we're in a better place. Katie, you and I have shared a lot of stories, both today and earlier in the time that we've known each other. You've had some pretty extraordinary experiences when it comes to people you've interviewed. The Today Show, all the years you anchored the Today Show, for 20 years?
15.
15?
Yeah.
And then, of course, at CBS, doing the evening news. You were talking to people of great consequence. The story I have to ask you about is Sarah Palin. She had been chosen, we know, by John McCain to be his running mate, made huge news. He had chosen a woman. And you went and you landed, I think, the only interview that she had agreed to do in the campaign.
Yeah, so what happened is, and then I'm excited for Judy to share some of the historic events that you covered, and one in particular, the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan. But, you know, I think one of the reasons this job is so thrilling, and has been for both of us, is you do, it sounds like a cliche, but you do have a front row seat to history. And, you know, I have had many sort of pinch me moments where I can't believe I find myself in the company of a president or a prime minister or Yasser Arafat or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, whose name always terrified me because I always thought I would stumble, and I just used, I'm a dinner jacket, I'm a dinner jacket. Mahmoud, I'm a dinner jacket, I'm a dinner jacket. Like when that teleprompter would roll out, I'd be like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, here it comes. I'd be like, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. See, I even screwed it up now. But with Sarah Palin, you know, they made a really dumb decision, I think, because she was relatively new to the national scene, and she just knocked it out of the park at the Republican National Convention, as you remember. Even though the teleprompter was blocked by a sign, she did the whole thing about the hockey mom and the lipstick, and she was really, I think, on her way to being a huge force in national politics. I thought, uh-oh, because at the time, Barack Obama's campaign had kind of flatlined, and she just burst onto the scene. But they really kept her away from the press, and I think it was because she was pretty green and inexperienced. She did an interview with Charlie Gibson, then she did an interview with Sean Hannity, and then she did an interview with me. And I thought there was still plenty of wood to chop, so I worked very hard. And what I really set out to do is to help illuminate her record and her, you know, political philosophy to a huge section of to people who really didn't know much about her. So I asked very open-ended questions, and I really wanted to see in real time, I wanted to see, you know, kind of test her political acumen without giving her a pop quiz or asking her gotcha questions.
Or gotcha questions.
But, you know, just really, and she stumbled badly. And of course, the section that got lifted and used again and again, what I asked her, and it was so funny, it was just a throwaway question. It was just to get video of us walking and talking to cut into the interview. And I said, I'm curious what newspapers and magazines you read that have shaped your worldview. Right. And by then, I think she was so sick of me, she gave the impression that she never read any newspapers and magazines. She said everything or anything they put in front of me. And I said, like what? And she couldn't really answer the question. And so I think a lot of people who were undecided at the time felt like, gosh, I'm not sure I feel confident in her being a heartbeat away from the presidency when John McCain had melanoma 4 times. Right. And so I think that was probably the most influential interview I have ever done.
And I think it's a reminder that sometimes the interviews that end up making a difference, or that are more illuminating of who someone is and what they believe, can just be, as you said, and it can be an offhand, it can be a follow-up question, it can be something that you didn't even plan to ask, but it evolved naturally in the conversation, and the person offered more themselves. But I will tell you, Katie, and I don't know if you agree with me about this, today, so many of the politicians we interview, and I've interviewed, like you, a lot of them over the years, going back to the Carter administration when I first came to Washington, politicians today are trained not to answer the question.
I know.
They are trained to keep it to themselves and to stick to whatever the storyline is that they want to get out there. And you have to find ways to ask a question this way, come at it this way and that way. And sometimes you're just flat out, it's hopeless, because they'll do anything they can to change the subject or just to smile and repeat whatever it is that they're saying. And then you end up looking like you're badgering them.
Right.
By trying to ask that one important thing that you'd like to you'd like to understand better, or you think the public would like to
Yeah, well,
understand
definitely.
better?
I mean, our role is to ask questions that will get answers that will help people understand either an issue or their position on an issue, and it is increasingly frustrating. I remember feeling so brave the first time I just said outright, "I'm sorry, Senator, you didn't answer my question.
I know.
Let me ask you again." And I'm sure you have said that plenty of times, Judy,
Well,
right?
Yeah, but you know, I mean, you don't. It's not fun to do that. I mean, you don't like to point out that someone isn't cooperating in an interview, but you think if they've
She's nicer than I am.
if they've made the decision to give you the interview, then that says to me, and if I'm talking about interviewing a politician, somebody
Right.
who is in a position to make a difference, who's in a position to change policy, to vote on something that's going to change our lives in some way. So it matters what they say. If they've made the decision to give you that time, but then they don't want to share anything other than just
Or reinforcing the party line.
The party line.
And that's on all sides of the political spectrum. Before we talk, Judy, about the changing media landscape, and I think we have seen, as Lisa said in our introduction, I mean, just seismic shifts in how media has changed because of when we respectively got into the business. But first, you know, you have been on the front row seat of history, and I know you've covered some really amazing stories. And when you think back at your incredible, illustrious career, is there one or two moments to stick out for you?
Well, that's a very polite way of saying your long career, five decades.
I'm right. No, I'm right there with you, sister.
No, but I mean, honestly, there's so many, and I did, as I mentioned, started with Jimmy Carter, and of course, watched that campaign, which was a miracle on the political scene, and then 4 years later went flaming up and went down in flames because he was defeated by Ronald Reagan. But what Katie referred to a minute ago was that I was part of the pool, the so-called press pool, the day President Reagan was shot. So I was there at the Hilton Hotel, just 30 feet away on the other side of his limousine, yelling a question at him about Lech Walesa, who was then the union leader in Poland, and it was at the center of news when we heard this pop, pop, pop sound. And you never want to think that that's going to happen. But as soon as it happened, people were yelling to get down, and they pushed President Reagan into the car. You've all seen the video by now. They pushed him into the car, and they were yelling at us, make a decision. Are you coming with us, or are you going to stay here? And of course, we had to stay to file, to report that it had happened, because we didn't know where the motorcade was going. And we had no idea that President Reagan had been shot, because there was no indication of that. What we saw were 4 bodies, 4 people who were lying on the ground, including Jim Brady, who was President Reagan's just named. This was 2 months into his administration. Jim Brady, press secretary, someone who my husband and I had gotten to know, lying on the ground with a head wound, and you knew it was serious. And this was way, Katie, before the days of the cell phone when you would automatically call your office. We had to go running for a payphone and into the Hilton Hotel. Everything was already taken. Your friend Sam Donaldson had already grabbed the phone right by the door. I went running across the street into a nondescript federal building, found a phone and called and was on the air with NBC, who I was working for. But it was a reminder that in an instant, things can change, and that reporters, you know, we get into this humdrum business of covering whatever story we are. If you're on a beat, whether it's the White House or covering the Hill, Capitol Hill or something, there can be, believe it or not, a humdrum nature to it. But it's a reminder that at any moment, life can change, history can change. And
think about 9/11.
Think about 9/11.
You know?
Oh my gosh. And I was at CNN that morning. I was getting into the car to go to the Capitol to interview Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, who were facing off against each other in a leadership race. And my researcher called me in my car and said, a plane has just gone to the World Trade Center, come into the Bureau right now. And then I went on the air and stayed on the air from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 or 7 that night. And of course, it upended everything we were doing. But in an instant, those things can happen, and a lot more, as we all know, has happened to this country and between the pandemic and so much more since then. The Oklahoma City bombing, we could go down the list. Reporters covering those stories, Katie, and I want you to talk about this, can be affected by what you cover. You can't witness some of these things that we've witnessed and not have them touch who we are as a person, even though we don't let ourselves be part of the story.
You know, MSNBC used to rerun the coverage of 9/11 every year, and once in a while I would listen to it, which was sort of strange, but I was on the Today Show, and, you know, and I remember exactly where I was. I remember looking at the World Trade Center and thinking, oh, a small plane must have flown into that building. I can't believe it, or Tower 1 or whatever, and running in, and the same thing, just being in complete disbelief during a break, calling my parents who lived in Arlington at the time and telling them to get in the basement, because it really felt like the world was ending, because you had both of the planes, and then you had the one that crashed in Shanksville. You had the one, you know, the Capitol was being evacuated, and the White House. And honestly, you just didn't know how many planes up there had been hijacked. And I just remember my hand shaking like that for hours. But, you know, you have to, I never felt such a greater sense of responsibility, knowing so many people watching the Today Show or wherever they were getting their news were just hungry for any information. It was just the most surreal day.
It was, and I remember being on the air at CNN when the anthrax. You remember the anthrax attacks, or the people were mailing anthrax to members of Congress, and some of it was fake, but there were also instances where it was real. And it's hard to believe it happened in our country. Our country has been through assassinations of presidents. I've been talking about the attempted assassination of a president, but we've lived through, you know, in our close to this era, the assassination of President Kennedy, and it's hard to believe that we've lived through this kind of upheaval, and yet we remain strong as a country. And yes, there are a lot of tests right now, and we can talk about that too, and how we are being tested as a nation, as a people, as media, and the role of the media in all of that. But we remain strong, and I come back to, I mentioned the pandemic a minute ago, and Katie, through the work you're doing, your media company, you've been watching this every day as well. But I know there were days we were going on the air during the pandemic and reporting the latest number of deaths, and it was just, I didn't have the words even to express how I felt.
It was devastating, and all the doctors and nurses and leaning out of the windows in New York and banging the pots and pans. And I remember looking for an expert, because I was doing a lot of interviews, and most of mine go on social media and our newsletter. And I looked for someone who could talk about the mental health infrastructure, the support that our healthcare professionals were getting, because they were so traumatized and exhausted and defeated. And I couldn't find anyone in New York City to talk about that, because sadly there were very few programs and you know, support structures in place to help these poor healthcare workers. You know, 30% of nurses have left the business, and but it was a terrible time. But you know, you mentioned, Judy, all these things that we have been through, and you would think that they might unite people. The pandemic, I think, did for a nanosecond, but very quickly the fractures in our society became increasingly evident. So I thought we could take a few minutes and talk about polarization, because I'm sure it's on everybody's minds. We don't know what to do about it. We are so deeply divided. And I have some thoughts, but I'm curious what you think is behind this intense polarization.
Well, I'm trying to understand it. I mean, you and I were talking about this. Since I stepped down from anchoring the NewsHour at the end of last year, I've taken on a 2-year project to try to understand and continue to report for the NewsHour, to try to understand why we're so divided. I mean, to your point, I've covered American politics for 50 years, and I've never seen us as divided as we are now. I know, of course, people say, well, there was the Civil War, and we were divided over the Vietnam War movement. we've had the civil rights movement and all that that's meant in divided Americans. But in my experience of covering American politics, we have not only, is this my observation, we've grown farther and farther apart. The people who study this will tell you, and we've interviewed folks at the Pew Research Center who say Americans who used to be here and here, if conservatives were here and liberals were here, today you ask them their opinions on issues, and it's like this. People are farther apart on the issues, and what's really interesting is that they have darker views of people on the other side. That they not only think the other side is mistaken, misinformed, they think they will tell you they're dishonest, they're immoral, they're not good citizens. And I will just say, I was just last night in Des Moines, Iowa, interviewing, and Katie and I were talking about this, we specifically wanted to hear from Republican voters because there will be Republican caucuses in Iowa in January or February. And of course, Donald Trump is in the running again. And we're asking voters about what issues might sway them to vote for one candidate or another. And we asked them about whether they thought a candidate's faith mattered to them. And in so many words, they said, we don't believe a Democrat. We don't believe you can be a Democrat and be a Christian, be someone of strong faith. So they were expressing, in a way, the kind of most profound kind of disagreement you can have with someone. On the other hand,
that's
they told
so
us,
bizarre to me
it
because
is,
I mean, hello, never mind, but yes.
But I mean, they were, and I wanted to have them, we were having a young woman who's a conservative pollster do these interviews with us, and we were videotaping the whole thing. But at one point, we had her ask them, would you object if your child married a Democrat? They all kind of, recoiled. But then they said, well, we guess we would go along with that. So there was some glimmer that they would be willing to have a mixed family.
Yeah,
a mixed family.
yeah.
But they were.
That usually would be a question about religion, right? If you're a Protestant, could you let your child marry somebody who's Jewish?
Someone who's Jewish,
yeah.
right? But they did express, I guess, there were other things that they said that led me to believe that. I mean, they said, for example, oh yeah, I have a neighbor, he's a Democrat, he thinks my views are awful, but we're still friends.
Yeah.
So I think maybe some of this polarization is pushed, and again, we were talking about this, it's pushed by the edges, the far right,
Definitely.
far left, pushing people to be farther apart.
And I think the most vocal people are the people on the extremes of either side. I highly recommend you read an article by Jonathan Haidt that came out, I think, within the last year, in The Atlantic, called Why the Last 10 Years Have Been Uniquely Stupid. And he basically talks about the loudest voices being very much on the end of the spectrum, both on the left and the right. But because they are the most vocal, they often drown out people who are in the middle who actually do want compromise. They don't think it's a dirty word. They want solution-oriented government. And I think, I looked at the Edelman Trust Barometer because it's something that I watch carefully, and it's really the impetus for the business model of our company, which we can talk about later. But right now, and this is sort of heartening for you all in this audience, it is the only institution that has maintained trust in our society is business. Businesses are the only institution of government, media, financial institutions, or whatever, business is considered the most competent and ethical of all the sort of institutions that exist in our society. Media trust is in the toilet. Government trust is in the toilet as well. Yeah. And I think, Judy and I have talked a lot about how media has changed so dramatically since we got into the business. And I think the fact that people can live in their own ecosystem and echo chambers and get, as my friend Nicole says, affirmation instead of information, it has made people much more deeply entrenched in their views, and it has raised the question of what is truth, what are facts, and you hear all these terms like we live in a post-factual society. We're experiencing truth decay. And it's really, really difficult when people are not operating under the same set of facts to have a conversation. So what happens is, you know, people are hearing what they want to hear instead of being challenged or being asked to be critical thinkers, and then they become more deeply entrenched in their own views. And a lot of these issues are incredibly complicated. They're not black and white issues. They require a lot of nuanced thinking and conversation and dialogue, and yet, I think the media doesn't have that enough. PBS NewsHour is the exception, I think, honestly. But we're looking for people. Kara Swisher calls it engagement through enragement. And I think it's true. I think now we're almost viscerally needing that kind of, yeah. And I watch everything because I'm curious about, I watch how Fox News is covering a story versus MSNBC. I read the New York Times, but I also read the Wall Street Journal because I'm trying to find, you know, what is the truth?
But so many people don't have time to read everything, and they're trying to find something, a place that they can trust to go to for news. And maybe they have 5 minutes, or maybe they have half an hour, but they don't know who to trust.
That's why you subscribe to Wake Up Call, our newsletter.
And I subscribe and I read it every day. But no, I mean, people don't know where to go. I feel like everyone in this room realizes this now. No more, what is it they say, no more Walter Cronkites. There's no one person we know we go to in a moment of worry or concern.
But the other thing, Judy, we were talking about is everyone's a commentator now. You know, you used to not be allowed to give your opinion. I would never give my opinion when I was anchoring the Today Show, maybe once in a while, like on temper tantrums in Barnes & Noble or something, you know? But if it came to a serious issue. It was just verboten to say, well, I think this or I think that. And now everyone is a commentator, so the lines have been blurred between pure journalism, what happened, and how you feel about what happened. And I think that has been a dangerous blending of those two things.
I completely agree with you, and I do think, I mean, we're going to talk about social media, but I think it drives. Not only do you have cable television, and I don't want to beat up on cable television because I think it comes in many forms, talk radio and everything. But what you're talking about is it thrives in conflict. They want people to fight. They want people to argue with each other. So instead of, as Katie says, you know, a lot of these stories are really hard to understand. You know, whether it's the environment, whether it's immigration, the economy, there's so many layers of complexity, and yet you're being told, well, we're going to argue because it's either this or that. Social media has driven us in that direction too. It's binary. You're either thumbs up, you like it, or you don't. And life is not that simple. And so we're being pushed to choose sides when we really don't need to choose. Yes, we need to ultimately make a decision about who we're going to vote for, of course. But in terms of understanding an issue, it's not a matter of hating this and loving that. It's understanding there are many different pieces to this story, and we need to do a better job of educating the American people about them rather than having a fight about it and thinking everything is a fight.
I guess the question is there a place, and CNN has been grappling with this, as you probably might have kept up with, you know, the new CEO of CNN was fired. His instructions were kind of to bring it more to the center. And I guess two things to talk about. Is there room for more objective news that is less partisan? You were talking about conflict. But now, if you watch the networks on cable anyway, which the average age is 64, nobody really under 45 is watching cable news as people are increasingly, cord cutting. But, you know, just the facts, ma'am, as you all, I think, did on PBS NewsHour, and they continue to do, it just isn't getting the eyeballs. And do you think that there can be a course correction, at least on cable or in news outlets in general?
Well, actually, what I would say, and not just in defense of the NewsHour, but our audience has remained strong, and it's grown a few million people a night, and that goes up and down depending on how newsy a period it is. But we have actually seen a lot of interest from people who want they tell us, we just want the news. We don't want to fight. We don't want argument. And yes, give us opinion once a week.
Or give us a
it's
smart,
David Brooks, and it was Mark Shields, bless his heart. We lost Mark last year, and now it's Jonathan Capehart. So there is and yes, this side and that side, but that's not the ethos of what the program is. But you're absolutely right, Katie. I mean, there's a lot more opinion, I think, out there today than we need. We need to be doing more reporting. We need to be doing more digging for facts. Katie and I were both having this conversation that we wish that all the cable channels, all of them, and I mean, no matter where they are on the spectrum, should be spending more time sending reporters out around the country and covering the news rather than sitting in the studio and arguing over what's happened. But you know, to your question, Katie, about whether straight news is viable, I think it can be if people in the media make it happen. And I do think that many American people, I hear it when I go out and talk to groups, people say, I'm sick of opinion. I'm sure I know that if I go to this channel or that radio show or that my favorite this or that, I can get opinion. But I also really want to understand what's going on in the world, and I'm trying to figure out, who to trust.
But I think the real shift, I think on these news networks, on cable, you don't really get a different point of view. You have the anchors pretty much pontificating. Yeah. And I'd like to see it return to anchors not rolling their eyes or slamming their hands on the desk, but actually giving the news, and if they want to go to different views, but I feel like they are the ones that should stay impartial. And Frank Sesno, who's a good friend who's Judy's known for years, my friend Wendy is in the audience, she worked for CNN for years and remains very close to Frank. He headed the media department at GW now. He said CNN needed a tonal shift. They needed to kind of, at the edges, change the way they presented the news, because the news is going to speak for itself. When someone is doing something that is clearly ethically questionable, I think we have to give viewers the respect they deserve, that they can then form their own opinions.
Yeah, I think you and I are on the same page on that. Both Katie and I, in whatever form it is, we think there needs to be more reporting, more straight reporting. There's always going to be room for some opinion, but it shouldn't be driving most of the news. People first need the facts, they need information, and then you can make up your own minds about who you want to vote for, what you want to believe. But that should be the principal role of the media, not to stir the pot and get everybody upset and angry.
And I think, we were saying the media is elite in many ways. They're in New York, they're in Washington, they're not necessarily living in the middle of the country. They are probably pretty well-heeled in general, and they have, Brian Stevenson, who is one of my personal heroes, who runs the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and just did the whole lynching memorial. He's just the most amazing person, but he talks about the importance of being proximate. And, if you're not with somebody who is in very different circumstances than yourself, if you're not meeting people who have different socioeconomic backgrounds or different experiences in terms of their religious backgrounds or their race, it's very hard to understand. And I think we do live in ivory towers in terms of the media. And I think just to, not to beat a dead horse, but I do think we need to get out and talk to people, and also so people can see themselves represented in the media. They need to see people who remind them who are experiencing the same things as them, to broaden their aperture of what is actually going on in the country.
Because we talk about diversity, and diversity is important. We need to be diverse, but diverse in every sense. And we have gotten diverse, but in an urban Washington and New York sense. We need to be representing the middle of the country. And again, I mean, I beat this drum a lot. I think we need to be sending reporters out and doing exactly
And you were just
what
talking,
said.
you were telling me about this man who would be a fascinating profile, and you're talking to farmers in Iowa.
Pennsylvania, talking to folks in Iowa, yes, and their stories are just extraordinary. I mean, whether they're on the left or the right politically, they each have a compelling story to tell, and that's the kind of thing that I think the media could be doing it's some of what we're trying to do at the NewsHour. It's certainly what I'm trying to do as I go out there and report about polarization and why people are divided. But the more we can hear from Americans themselves, I think yes, we want to hear from the experts. We want to hear from the Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, name your university. And we do talk to the experts, and they do know a lot, and they're doing extraordinary work. And we're going to mention in the minutes that we have remaining, I do want to talk about one thing that's come up that is very much an ivory tower issue, but yet it's affecting all of us, and that's AI. But the press has gotten to a point where we are, I think, living separately from most of the country, and I don't think it's healthy.
Let's talk a little bit also, I think, about disinformation, because and that will kind of lead us seamlessly into AI, because disinformation is something that is also feeding polarization and fueling polarization. And you know, I'm curious. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about my experience, because I was the co-chair of the Aspen Institute Commission on disinformation, and it's a serious problem, one that Barack Obama says is the biggest threat to our democracy, because again, you have mistrust in the media, and then you have people making up stories and saying things that are completely fabricated and not true. So it is really, it's going to be an even greater problem with AI, because that kind of disinformation can be not only manufactured, but also disseminated in a matter of seconds. And so it's a really scary thing in terms of the future. I mean, we can talk about AI and job displacement, but one of the things people are really worried about is disinformation. And we came up with a couple of recommendations, which I'll tell you all quickly, was more transparency between these tech platforms and the scientists who are studying how these algorithms work and how disinformation speeds around the internet and all over the place in a matter of seconds even now, and how you combat that. So we need that. We need greater transparency in terms of how the inner workings of Facebook or Meta or whatever it's called now. We also need to strengthen local news. 2,000 newspapers have shut down since 2004. And they've shown that if you are engaged in local news, you have a much higher likelihood of being engaged in national news. Right. And you also trust your local news much more than the national news. Again, this idea of being proximate. Exactly. People are talking about issues that are in your neighborhood or in your backyard. And then, of course, another thing is to reevaluate Section 230, which prevents all these big companies from having any liability, because they claim they're not publishers. They're just the pipes from which all this information flows. So I think we have still a lot of work to do when it comes to reducing disinformation, which I, again, think it feeds on the distrust, and then that increases polarization.
And I think your point, I mean, all of that is important. I think what's happened to local news is a central concern for all of us right now, because, as you say, if you don't know what's going on in your own community, if you don't know what's happening, your local school board, your county commission, the zoning board, if you don't know those things, if you don't know what the powerful people in your community are doing, and you don't have people asking tough questions of them when they make decisions that affect the lives of everyone in the community, you're not together, you're not held together, you're not as engaged as citizens if you just don't know this. And so we now have, as Katie suggested, thousands of newspapers have gone out of business, thousands of reporters have been laid off, and right now we have what we call news deserts in the country, where people just don't have any access. So there's a big movement now on the part of foundations. I'm sure many of you have read about it, to try to seed online, mainly online because it's more affordable, get some of these reporters who were laid off over the last 10, 15, 20 years and get them out and reporting again.
But
and it's not just about journalism,
right.
It is about our democracy, and it's about keeping our communities strong.
And you know, for businesses, somebody can write something and it can just tank the stock price in a nanosecond. And it's really important, I think, for businesses to appreciate the things that they can do to reduce disinformation that is targeting them. You know, you have to have an infrastructure, you have to have employees, you have to actually take this super seriously and monitor some of the things that are going on and being said about your company. You have to be transparent to increase trust with your customers and other consumers. And the Edelman Trust Barometer should buoy you to say, gosh, people trust us, so what role can we take in eradicating or reducing disinformation? How can we prop up legitimate sources of information? And there's even something called pre-bunking instead of debunking, where you can almost anticipate disinformation that might be out there and how you can nip it in the bud. So I think it's something that corporate America is really going to have to focus on, because it can tank you in a minute. And there's scary stuff going on out there with deep fakes and taking somebody and making it look like they're saying something that they're not. Criminals are using AI to put together, for example, you and I would be easy targets for this. Criminals are taking voices and they're putting messages together. Like I saw this on the news the other day. A grandmother got a call. They had put together her grandson's voice to say, "I'm in trouble," and then somebody got on and impersonated like a police officer and said, "We're not going to arrest your son, but you need to bring $8,000. So this poor elderly lady goes to the ATM, she gets her bank account, takes out $8,000, gives it to some guy, and it's a complete scam. And so I was talking to some friends the other day. I think this is sort of helpful because I'm going to do it with my family, but they said your family should have a safe word. So you can say to somebody who's calling and impersonating your kid, what is our safe word? And if they don't know it, well, that's a big risk, right? But if they don't know it, that's an indication that this could be somebody who is scamming you. But the technology is so terrifying right now, right?
It really is. And I have a feeling this audience knows it. I'm looking at the clock, Katie. Are we supposed to be going to audience questions yet, or
I think
can somebody give us a signal?
I think we have a few more minutes before audience questions.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think so, because I think it goes to zero when we take audience questions. Judy,
you would think we would know how to do these things.
Yeah, really.
We're looking at the clock and we're figuring, is this the countdown clock, or is it the countdown to questions?
Let's talk about the changing workplace for a moment, because I think this is something that perhaps this audience would be interested in talking about. I've been reading recently that a lot of companies are requiring employees to return to the office. And this is a big source of contention for workers in terms of, can you trust people, or can people be as productive if they're working remotely? Or do they have to have FaceTime and actually come in and meet in person with some of their colleagues? And I think this is going to be a debate that is going to continue for some time to come. But I have a lot of friends arguing that this is going to really hurt working families and working parents, because the added flexibility has been a godsend to many of these working mothers in particular, who still do the lion's share of the domestic labor, unfortunately. Come on, men, it's called chore play. Get with it. But I think that's because I think close to 2 million women left the workforce because of the pandemic, because they couldn't handle it. So many women leaders recently, the head of YouTube and the head of a number of companies, have left because they just can't manage it all. Do you see companies, Judy, and I don't know how PBS is on this, trying to accommodate working parents more so we don't lose so many people in the workforce because they can't have families and have full-time jobs. They can't do it all, even though we were told we could.
Yeah, I think we've come a long way in that regard. I mean, we all know that there was a time when you couldn't, either parent
Right.
wouldn't get much time off. Today, of course, there's much more. I mean, my colleagues who are the dads when their babies are born are now taking 6 weeks, 8 weeks of parental leave when a baby comes along. And I do see a better, more welcoming attitude on the part of employers that I'm familiar with in the media in terms of making time for when there's a sick member of the family, when there's a parent. I mean, we all know the sandwich generation,
right? Taking
care of parents in crisis. So I want to believe there's more space there than there used to be, but I think we are, frankly, we've been made much more vividly aware of it because of the pandemic, and we've seen what it's like when you're able to be with your family, you're able to see your children when they come home from school, or you're able to spend time with that older family member who's there. Whereas we go back to the old system and you're gone all day long. I mean, even though my husband and I raised 3 children, we were gone all day long,
right,
because we were working. I want to believe that more and more employers are understanding it's the whole family, it's not the whole family, the whole person that they need to take care of, and not just the part that that comes in and does the job.
Not to be a Debbie Downer, but I've got some really sad statistics along these lines that I got in preparing for our conversation. By the end of 2020, women's share of the labor force had fallen to its lowest level since 1987. Many senior-level women, exhausted and torn between their career ambitions and personal lives, are now bowing out. Some are switching to less demanding positions or changing industries, while others are giving up lucrative paychecks and simply walking away. Several recent studies have documented the same disturbing trend, which government data isn't fully capturing. And a recent survey from the Society for Human Resource Management found that the number of employers offering paid maternity leave beyond what is required by law dropped from 53% in 2020 to 35% this year. By reneging on things like flexible work and children, employers are making it plain. Yeah, and according to a new report by Lean In, the number of women leaving their employers is the highest it's been in 5 years, even with the slowing job market. And now people are talking— I wonder if
that's the pandemic.
Yeah, and people are talking about, what is it called, returnships instead of internships. They're trying to lure more women and some men into the office by figuring out how they can have more flexibility. But listen, it's hard. It's such a hard balance. And I think for me, as somebody who's been in working for a long time, I still have sort of biases sometimes about what women or men or anybody working from home, like, oh yeah, okay, sure. Even though it's shown that they are even more productive when they work remotely.
Well,
so I think there's still a lot of attitudes that
I think
need
that's
to be
right.
addressed.
Although at the NewsHour, I mean, I anchored from home for the first year of the pandemic. My colleagues to this day, most of them are working from home partly because we're building a new studio building, but also because they've found they can do the work.
Yeah.
They can be productive. And then you get into the whole question of it bleeds over, when is it work time, when is it family and home time and personal time? And colleagues were talking frankly about burnout, because they felt from the moment they wake up in the morning until the moment they went to sleep at night, hello journalism, they were on call. They were working.
Well, I think iPhones have changed everything. You used to be able to leave work and leave it behind and really have a separate work and personal life, and now everything's bled into the other. But I thought this was interesting too, and then I'll stop talking about this. But says companies should be guided by the data, and the data shows that remote workers log longer days than those who commute. And during those hours, they're more engaged, creative, and productive than in-office employees, which I think is really interesting.
It'd be great to do a survey of all of you about what you think about this whole question of going into the office. But we won't do that. We're not going to put anybody on the spot. We won't do that.
Thank you for all you've done around journalism and media and strengthening what we're hearing and the facts we're hearing, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.